Today marks 80 years since the liberation of the Nazi death camp Auschwitz-Birkenau, a name that has forever scarred our collective memory. This anniversary is a solemn occasion, a time to remember the millions of innocent lives stolen by Nazi tyranny. It's also a day to honor the survivors, their numbers dwindling, their courage and resilience an inspiration to us all. In the next hour, we'll reflect on the events of this very dark chapter in human history, and most importantly, we'll hear directly from those who lived through the horrors of Auschwitz. We want to go now to my colleague, Julia Saldelli. She is at today's commemoration events at the former Auschwitz-Birkenau camp located in Poland. Julia, while we are waiting for the commemorations to start, kind of set the stage for us today. What can we expect?
Yeah, so we already saw some survivors come together this morning here at Auschwitz, and they laid candles and paid tribute to those who didn't survive the camp, but also remembered their own experiences here. And they laid these candles at what is called the Wall of Death, which is the area of Auschwitz where executions would take place, where people would be executed and shot to death. And that was a very touching moment this morning. And through the day, we've seen delegations from heads of state and government also visiting the site here to also pay tribute. And now the commemoration ceremony is about to start, and we can expect to see there some musical tributes played, some music being played, and these are all pieces of music that were composed, for example, by survivors of the camp here at Auschwitz and people who are have some sort of connection here to Auschwitz. And we also expect some survivors to speak. The director of the Auschwitz Memorial has said that this year the focus will be on the survivors. There will be no politicians or people involved in politics, heads of state, giving any speeches. The attention will all be on the survivors, and the focus will be, and the time will be dedicated to them to commemorate, to remember, and to also make sure that not only the survivors who had to experience the atrocities here in Auschwitz, but also younger generations, people who weren't alive at the time, remember what happened and keep that strong in mind.
Yeah, the attention today on the survivors. And that's important because their numbers are dwindling with each passing day. That's important to keep in mind. Here in the studio with me is my colleague, our correspondent, Shani Rosanis. Shani, maybe if you could talk to me about the significance of this day, particularly for Jewish people. I mean, the world is focusing on Auschwitz. Why is it so important today?
Well, this is a relatively new occasion in the international, calendar, I would say. It's only been instated by the UN in 2005, so 20 years ago. And of course, the symbolism behind the whole world taking an International Holocaust Day and commemorating that, the terrible atrocities of the Holocaust was very meaningful. When it was instated, it was originally an initiative of the government of Israel back then, but it became ever since quite a consensus in many other nations in the world, Germany, of course, included. And this ceremony in Auschwitz is a very big pillar of that, to bring us back to the place that was liberated on this day. And this is why this date was chosen, the 27th of January.
Yeah, we're looking at these live pictures there. We see right there King Charles from the UK. You see the German president, Walter Steinmeier, behind him. We also saw the Ukrainian president, Zelenskyy, there. Shani, I mean, it has been 80 years since this camp was liberated, and we know with the passage of time, the voices of those who actually survived, their voices are dwindling in numbers, right?
Correct. We have less than 250,000 survivors still alive in the world, born anytime between 1928 and 1946, or even the younger amongst them are quite old, in their, reaching 80 years old. Of course, that's the nature of biology. Time passes, they have to pass, but it leaves on us the question and the obligation to think, how do we keep on the message, the legacy, of their bravery of what they have been through and what humanity needs to learn from the Holocaust and what it bared with it for so many suffering, not just of Jews, but so many others. And this is something that we've been grappling with, I think, as a society, definitely in Germany, for quite some time, but it's something that the world is slowly starting to realize. It's a problem that we need to think of.
Yeah, I mean, how would you grade society, modern society's ability right now to convey the lessons from Auschwitz, from the Holocaust, to the new generation?
I think it's a challenge. You know, those witnesses, even when they do still manage to go to schools, to be active in bringing education to the younger generation, the gap is big to the extent that you're not sure you reach those young people. But there are also bolder attempts that sometimes get a lot of criticism on trying to make it more accessible. One of the survivors we will see today, for example, has a TikTok account where she's trying to connect to the younger generation with the help of her grandchildren and tell about her, survival and her story.
We're watching these live pictures here, and the first speaker is now approaching the podium. Let me just tell you a little bit about who we're about to hear from right there. You see him. It's Marian Turski, a Polish historian, journalist, Holocaust survivor, served as editor-in-chief of the Standard Mlodych, I hope I pronounced that right, which is a nationwide daily newspaper of the Union of Polish Youth back in 1956 and 1957. And from 1958 onwards, he was a columnist for the moderately critical Polityka as the head of the weekly's historical department. So this is a journalist who we see right now. He's going to give the opening comments when he approaches the podium or reaches the podium. And I think let's just for a moment to maybe soak in what we're seeing right now, because just the act of him walking up to the podium is not an easy act for him, because this is not a young man, right?
And this is not an easy situation to be in or an easy place to be going back to. Auschwitz, as you rightfully said at the beginning, it haunts humanity.
Okay, let's listen in.
Of all the survivors, I welcome the distinguished guests. I welcome all who have gathered here in this tent. I welcome those who are listening to us on the radio and who watch us on TV and in all the other media. However, first and foremost, my warmest thoughts and feelings go towards you, my fellows, men and women who have shared this misery with me, the inmates. Today, we commemorate the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of the Holocaust. It is absolutely understandable, if not downright obvious, that people, that the media turn to us, to those who survived, so that we shared with them our memories. However, there's always been a very small minority of us who went through all those selections positively. That number itself was very little, and those who lived to see freedom, there were hardly none. So few.
A teraz
And now
została tylko
there is only a handful.
Dlatego
Such a small
sądzę,
bevy.
że nasze
That is why
myśli
I believe that
Nasze-
our thoughts
powinniśmy skierować
should now
ku
go
olbrzymiej
towards
większości,
this huge
ku
majority,
tym milionom,
those
ofiar.
millions of victims
które nigdy nam nie powiedzą,
who will
Co
never
przeżywały,
tell us
co
what they
czuły.
experienced, what they felt,
ponieważ
just
pochłonęła
because
je
they
zagłada.
were consumed by that mass destruction,
Zachował się
the Shoah.
wszakże pewien
However,
dokument.
there is a certain document
dokument,
that has survived,
wiersz,
a document, a poem,
który w jakimś stopniu
that to a particular degree
coś tam mówi nam o tych właśnie ludziach.
tells us something about those very people.
Zapamiętajcie Państwo
And do remember the name.
Henryka Łazowert.
It's by Henryka Łazowert.
Łazowert.
Henryka Łazowert.
Była polską poetką.
She was a Polish poetess.
Miała nawet bardzo udane próby.
She had very successful attempts at writing literature.
Miała możliwość ukrycia
She
się
had an opportunity to
poza murami,
hide
ale
beyond
nie chciała
the walls
zostawić
of the ghetto,
matki.
but she was loath to
Kiedy
leave her
dzisiaj
mother behind.
Słucham,
Today, when I listen
wydaje mi się, jakby to było coś
to her
poza
poem,
sezonowego.
I find it as something that goes absolutely beyond any
Jest to
thing
dokument,
that the mind can imagine. This is
mamy
a
jej
document.
zdjęcie.
We have a
Była
photo
urodziwą
of Henryka.
kobietą.
She was
Miała
a beautiful
lat
woman.
33.
She was
Była
33.
już uznaną poetką.
By that time, she had been a recognized poet,
Polską.
a Polish poet.
Pisała po polsku,
She wrote in Polish,
ale jako
and
Żydówka
as a Jewess,
została,
she was sentenced to annihilation.
miała szansę ukrycia się po tak zwanej
She had an opportunity
aryjskiej
to
stronie,
find a hiding place
ale nie
on the
chciała
so-called Aryan side,
opuścić
but she
matki.
didn't want to
Napisała
leave her mother.
list
She wrote a letter, a
do
poem
swojego przyjaciela.
to her friend.
Zacytuję ten
Let me quote that letter.
Odjeżdżam gdzieś tam,
I'm going
bardzo daleko,
somewhere there,
do stacji
to a very distant place,
nieznajomej, której
a
nie
station
ma na
that is
żadnej
unknown,
mapie.
for it is not in any
Nad
map.
dworcem niebo wisi
There
jak
is
wielkie
the sky hanging
czarne
over the station
wieko.
like a huge black
Lokomotywa
lid.
krzyczy
The engine
głosem
shrieks
bitego
with the
człowieka.
voice of a beaten man.
Kolejarze mają
The train drivers have the faces of paper. All I have with me is just one suitcase and one grief that no one's ever tried to plummet. I'm so very composed, and what you cannot see at all, so very sad. Be healthy, my distant. There are hearts where nothing changes. I am no longer. No longer. May I ask all the present to stand up for a moment's silence?
Dziękuję.
Thank you.
Dziękuję.
Thank you very much.
Drodzy przyjaciele,
Dear friends,
od co najmniej 2000 lat
for at least 2,000 years
naszej cywilizacji
of our civilization,
towarzyszy
we've been accompanied by a vision
apokalipsy.
of apocalypses.
Oto pojawiają się 4 jeźdźcy
Here,
apokalipsy.
The 4 riders of
Wojna,
apocalypse arrive:
Zaraza,
war, pestilence,
i
hunger,
śmierć.
and death.
Ludzie są porażeni
People are
strachem,
perplexed with
sparaliżowani
fear,
tym
paralyzed with that
czują
fear.
się całkowicie
And they feel
bezradni.
absolutely helpless.
Co robić?
What can be done?
Chciałbym tutaj
At this
zacytować
point, I would like to
pieśń,
quote
którą
a
na
song
pewno
that
wielu z was
certainly many of you
rozpoznałoby, gdybym
would
ją
recognize
zanucił.
if
Nie
I
ma
hummed
obawy.
the tune.
Nie
But
będę
don't worry,
śpiewał,
I'm not going to sing.
ale
But all I want
zwrócić
is
uwagę
to
na
draw your attention
tekst
to the lyrics,
niesłychanie
because
inspirujący.
these lyrics are exceptionally inspiring.
Którego autorem
The author of the lyrics is
Rabbi Nachman,
Rabbi
z
Nachman of
Wrocławia,
Bratslav,
ale znany bardziej
who was
jako
better known
Rabbi
as
Nachman
Rabbi
Humania,
Nachman of Humain,
ponieważ tam
because
kazał
that
się
was where
pochować
he
między
had his body
grobami
buried
ofiar
among
pogromu.
the graves of the victims of a pogrom.
Kol ha'olam kulo. Cały nasz świat, nasz świat.
All our world, the whole world we have,
Gesher, cały mrod jest niczym
is nothing,
bardzo wąski.
a very narrow bridge,
Wyhaikar, a co najważniejsze,
and which is most
lo
important,
lefachet klal. Nie bać się wcale.
one must not be afraid at all.
Więc
Thus,
nie bać się.
not to be
Widzimy
afraid,
w świecie
we see
współczesnym
in the contemporary
Dzisiaj.
world
teraz
today
wielki
and
wzrost
now
antysemityzmu.
we see a
A
huge
to
rise
przecież
in anti-Semitism,
właśnie antysemityzm
and that is
doprowadził
precisely
do Holokaustu.
anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust.
Deborah Lipstadt
Deborah
nazwała
Lipstadt
to
called it
tsunami antysemityzmu.
the tsunami
A
of
to właśnie
anti-Semitism,
jej odwaga,
and it
jej
was
uporczywość
her
i wytrwałość
courage,
w
her
walce z zaprzeczeniem
tenacity in
Holokaustu,
fighting with
czyli
Holocaust denial,
of the Holocaust,
which in English is called the denial of the Holocaust,
zakończyła się
put
sukcesem po
an end to
wygranym
it.
w
It
Londynie
ended in a success
procesie
after she
z
won a
Davidem
trial
Irvingiem.
against David Irving in London.
Nie bójmy się wykazać
Let us not
takiej samej
fear
odwagi dzisiaj,
demonstrating the
gdy
same
Hamas
courage today
czyni
when Hamas
próby zaprzeczania
attempts
masakry
at denial
7
of
października.
the massacre of the 7th of October.
Nie bójmy się
Let us not
przeciwstawiać
oppose
teoriom spiskowym, że
the
wszystko,
conspiration
co złe
theories
na świecie,
saying that
jest skutkiem
all the evil of this
zawiązania
world
spisku
results from
przez
a plot
nieokreślone
started by
grupy
some
społeczne.
indefinite
A
social
Żydzi
groups,
są
and
tu
Jews
często
are
wymieniani.
often mentioned as one of
Nie
such.
bójmy się
Let us not
rozmawiać
fear
o problemach
discussing the
dręczą
problems that
tak zwane
torment
ostatnie
the
pokolenie.
so-called last generation.
Naruszają, co prawda, ci młodzi ludzie
These young
nasz
people
porządek
may
społeczny,
disturb our social
nasz
order.
system,
They may disturb
prawny,
our system of
ale
truth.
sędzia,
Yet,
który wydał wyrok,
whether the
wypowiedział
judge has
znamienne
pronounced the
słowa,
sentence when he
może
uttered those
dziś
memorable words,
wskazują
perhaps today
jutrzejszych
I
bohaterów.
sentence tomorrow's heroes.
Nie bójmy się
Let us not be
przekonywać
afraid
samych siebie,
to convince
że można
ourselves
rozwiązywać
that we
problemy
can
między
solve
sąsiadami.
problems between
Od setek
neighbors,
lat
because
na
for
różnych
centuries, on many
różne
continents,
narody,
many nations,
narodowości
many peoples,
lub grupy
and
etniczne
many ethnic groups
mieszkały
have
i
lived
żyły obok
and
siebie
have
i między
had
sobą.
their homes among
Uprzedzenia
one
wzajemne,
another and between one
hejtowanie,
another.
nienawiść
All the hatred,
doprowadzały
all
do
the hate
konfliktów
speech
zbrojnych
led to
między
armed
tymi
conflicts
sąsiadującymi
between those
narodami
neighboring
i grupami
peoples and
etnicznymi.
ethnic groups.
Kończyło się to
That
zawsze
always
przelewem
ended
krwi.
in bloodshed.
Ale są na szczęście
Yet, luckily,
doświadczenia
there are the
pozytywne,
positive
gdy
experiences
obie
as well
strony
when
dochodzą
both the
do
sides
wniosku, że
reach
nie
a
mają
conclusion
innego
that they
sposobu
have no
zapewnienia
other way of
spokojnego,
ensuring a
bezpiecznego
peaceful, safe and
życia
secure life
swoim dzieciom,
for their children,
wnukom,
grandchildren,
przyszłym pokoleniom,
and for the future generations
doprowadzenia
than
do
leading
kompromisu.
to a compromise.
Powołam się na dwa
Let me
przykłady
quote here
z
two
Europy.
examples from
Niemcy
Europe,
i Francuzi,
Germans
Polacy
and the French,
i Litwini.
Poles and Lithuanians.
Powtórzę,
Let me
nie bójmy
reiterate,
się
let us not
przekonać
fear
samych siebie,
convincing
że trzeba
ourselves
mieć
that
wizję nie
one
tylko
needs to
tego,
have a vision
co dziś jest,
not only
ale
of
tego,
what is here
co będzie
today, but also what is going to come tomorrow
za kilkadziesiąt
and what will come
lat.
in several decades.
Dziękuję
Thank
za
you
uwagę.
for your attention.
And we just heard from the 98-year-old Marian Turski there, an Auschwitz survivor, also with the International Auschwitz Council. That was the welcome address. Let me just ask you, Shana, here while we're waiting for the next speaker to come up, a very slow, a very deliberate message, and a warning as well.
Very much, he seems to be sending a message of may have not learned all the lessons that should be learned. Very much talking about Holocaust deniers and the need to struggle, to fight against that. But he also tried to remain a bit optimistic, quoting a known Jewish rabbi about how fear is never a good plan. How you need to. There's many threats. And the only way to tackle them is definitely not by fear. And this 90-year-old man, everything he's been through, and you know, as a journalist, you see his sharp mind, the way he was trying to build a very elaborate case here in his speech. It's interesting to notice that all the four speakers we will see are all Poland natives or born in Poland. Not all of them have stayed in Poland like he has, which is also quite a rare example.
We can just listen in for a moment. And we are now waiting for the second speaker to come up, and that's
Teraz wysłuchajmy głosu świadków.
Janina,
O
Iwanska,
zabranie głosu
95
proszę
years
ocalałą
old. You say next speaker.
panią Janinę
Correct.
Iwańską.
A Warsaw native who has had all her life been very much in Warsaw, in the city.
She lived in the Warsaw ghetto, it says here, with
Correct.
her
And then
parents
she went
and her
back to
brother.
Warsaw after the war, and this is something I was trying to touch on before. The Jewish community in Poland was the biggest Jewish community in Europe at the eve of World War II, and it was almost fully decimated. Over 3 million of the about 3.5 million who used to live in Poland have been murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust, and many who tried to come back after the Holocaust found it to be very complicated to stay in Poland, then also after under Soviet occupation. Very few Polish Jews who were Polish natives have remained
Szanowni
in Poland.
Państwo,
Ladies and gentlemen,
pół roku temu, w czerwcu, byłam tutaj, żeby
half a year
uczcić
ago,
pierwszy
in June, I
transport
was here
więźniów do
to commemorate the
Auschwitz.
first transport of inmates to Auschwitz. These were Polish inmates that had been moved here from Tarnów. 728 people altogether. This was the 84th anniversary of the first transport. This is the 80th anniversary of the camp liberation, when the camp stopped its operation. 4.5 years. This is how the camp operated. Now, this camp changed significantly. Originally, it was a camp for political prisoners, people who were not happy with German occupation. These were mostly Poles, mostly adults. Then, Poles were no longer allowed to form associations, including scouting. This is when younger people, boys, would be moved here, teenage boys, for their activity in the scouting, Polish scouting movement. So, for a time, most of the inmates were Poles here. Then, this camp turned into a camp for Soviet POWs. Tens of thousands of POWs were moved here. But these were not, or rather this camp became a labor camp. So firstly, in August, those Russians and Poles would become subjects. They were used to test various killing gases to see which gas would be the most efficient. Then in September 1941, those Soviet POWs that survived were moved to Brzezinka, the village of Brzezinka. This is where we are, and this is where, when then started building the Birkenau camp. And they worked throughout a very heavy winter. Remember, winters here were truly tragic. Lots of poverty, lots of very hard work, and little to eat. If you disliked anything, you would be killed. March 1942, this is when the camp was commissioned. 12,000 survivors were moved here, but only 500 survived. Once Birkenau was ready, women would be brought in, because until that point there had been no women. Women from Poland and from all over Europe. Belgians, French, Czech, Romanian women, and most of them were Polish. Now, the operators of the camp, which gas worked the best, which is when they started building gas chambers. In autumn, they started the construction of the gas chambers and the crematoria. April next year, the crematoria were ready, so were the gas chambers. And that is when it was no longer a POW camp, a Soviet camp. This is when the killing machine started its operation. This is when the killing factory started its operation. All they would do here would be killing people. Some people would be moved to other camps, but most would be exterminated. It is difficult to calculate all the people killed here. Most would be registered, marked, but many a time inmates, people would be brought in here from other countries, and they would be driven directly to gas chambers. and crematoria. It is calculated that around 1 million Jews were murdered this way, so they would be taken directly from the ramp to the gas chambers. Nobody knows exactly how many people died here. Now, the year was 1943. Apart from Jews and Aryan people from all over Europe and other continents, including Asia and North America, they would bring in Roma. They called it the Gypsy camp. Roma and Sinti would be put there. They called it the family camp. Families would be brought in here, Roma with their wives and children. Dr. Mengele would take care of them. Even before the war, Mengele actually had conducted experiments aimed at proving that the German race was superior. All the others were inferior, and the Jews and the Roma were basically inhuman, so they should be exterminated. The Roma were brought in here in whole families because he specialized in conducting experiments on children. Where you had a family, there were also children then, and they, or rather then, he would experiment on newborns, on babies. Many Roma died here because of diseases, misery. Now, in August 1943, there were as many as 4,000 Roman Sinti living there. There was this night, on the 3rd, they were all taken directly to gas chambers. In the morning, on the next day, not a single living Roma or Sinti was there, because Mengele had completed his experiments and he no longer needed the material to work on. So it was August 1944, close to the end of the war. That is when the uprising broke out on the 1st of August. It was an uprising against the Germans. The Germans were to leave the city because the Soviets, the Russians, were on the other side of on the other bank of the river. Poles rose because they wanted to win the capital, but the Germans would return and started destroying the capital. They were given orders to flatten the city. All the inhabitants of the city were to be exterminated. In the first 6 days, in the district of Wola, 50,000 civilians were killed. They would be dragged out of their homes and flats and shot on the street. Their houses would be set on fire. I lived in the very same neighborhood. So a bit later, they would be there too. A special camp was set up close to Warsaw. The houses would be set on fire, people would be brought to this camp in Pruszków, a temporary camp, and segregation would take place there. Those who couldn't work would be taken first to Germany for forced labor, and then they would be moved to concentration camps. August the 12th, this is when I was transported here to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Tens of thousands of Warsavians were moved here. Many women were moved to Ravensbrück and men to Buchenwald and other camps in Germany. Also, here,
nastąpiło wyzwolenie, to święto, które dzisiaj obchodzimy.
So, what are we celebrating today? We are celebrating the liberation. This is when the camp stopped its operation. When it happened, there were few inmates. The Germans were truly perfidious. You could hear the shots of approaching frontline, and yet they decided to take the inmates out of the camp and move them elsewhere. So those that had stayed were the sick, the young, pregnant women. So when the camp was liberated, basically only 5 to 10% of inmates were liberated. 100,000 inmates were taken out of here. They were forced on the death march to Władysław and then to other camps. Ravensbrück and one more camp were my stopovers. So I was liberated truly later. People use this expression, prison or concentration camp. It seems innocuous. People were kept there. But the thing is, this camp had been undergoing a number of metamorphoses until it morphed into a killing site. I would like to read a quote to you. The war finished in 1945. People all over the world were in euphoria. Never again was the slogan. People believed that the war would never happen again. Picasso painted this dove of peace. And yet, there were people who made certain predictions. They predicted that it is impossible for these things never to happen again. Because people became so inhuman that it might happen again. In 1950, a Polish writer and essayist wrote something about the war. Now, he wrote a lot about the war and war in general. He published these articles, these columns, and let me read out to you his words. He wrote the following: if Europe, ravaged by these follies, is to avoid destruction, its people must learn to anticipate better the consequences of their actions. They must not disregard those who possess such foresight. For the older generation, this may be of lesser concern. My thoughts are with the young, those who have their lives ahead of them. War and chaos can erupt anywhere, leaving no place or reason to flee. Thank you very much.
That was the 95-year-old Janina Iwanska speaking there, a Holocaust survivor, Auschwitz survivor. And China, let me just ask you, what really struck me is what she said at the very end there, that liberation came later. It didn't come actually 80 years ago today.
Well, in a certain way, the war kept on going, and only in May, we know, is Victory Day. And so for her, because she was no longer in the camp, that was the case, indeed. And it's interesting that she found it important in this commemoration to also bring to the front all those who were not Jews, who were murdered and butchered by the Nazis, the Sinti and Roma, but of course prisoners of war, political prisoners, Russians, and people from all over Europe. Of the 1.1 million estimated people were murdered to death in Auschwitz. Out of them, around 900,000 are believed to be Jewish, but the other 200,000 were just people that other people.
This is Tova Friedman.
January 27th. My whole life, since I was a little girl, I thought of it as my birthday. This is my birthday, January 27th. I celebrate it every single year. In fact, today I got all kinds of emails. Some of my friends don't even know that I have a regular birthday, because this is what counts. Never did I imagine that I would celebrate this year with such a fabulous audience, so many people, such important people. And it's an honor. It's an honor to be there. It's an honor to address you. And I want to thank you to listen to me, because I represent the children. There are very few of us are left. From my town, 4 children survived. So I'm here to talk about those who aren't here. And I'm very honored to speak to this kind of audience that has come from all over the world to mourn, remember, and honor the memory of our people who were so brutally murdered by the Nazis. However, we are also here to proclaim and to pledge that we will never, never, ever allow history to repeat itself. I would like to share some of my memories, because I know that there are many survivors here who are struggling with their own. I was just 6.5 years old when I was liberated from Auschwitz. But my memories are very vivid, thanks to my mother, who constantly validated the events to me as they were happening. When she was with me, she never, ever covered anything up. I remember, as a 5.5-year-old child, watching from my hiding place in Starchowitz labor camp, as all my little friends were rounded up and driven to their deaths, while the heartbreaking cries of their parents fell on deaf ears. After all the children were gone and the courtyard was empty, I thought to myself, am I the only Jewish child left in the world? Shortly thereafter, we were loaded into cattle cars. The men and women were separated. This was the very first time I ever saw my father cry. Up until then, no matter what horrors, no matter what happened to us, we were together, the 3 of us. We were a family. But now, he was sent to Dachau, and my mother and I here to this camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Hot, hungry, thirsty, and very terrified, I held on tightly to my mother's hand in the dark cattle car for countless hours, while the cries and the prayers of so many desperate women permeated my soul and haunt me to this day. Finally, we arrived at Auschwitz, a gloomy Sunday with a sky obscured by smoke and a terrible stink hung in the air. And there were rows and rows of naked women all around me. What are they looking for? I asked my mother as I too was naked. And I tried to avoid the gleam of the German shepherd's teeth and their eyes. I was their height, so I can see them completely. I can still see their eyes to this day. My mother answered me, diseases. But if we are ill, she didn't have to finish. She pointed to the smoke right by the entrance. I knew at 5.5 what that meant. We all knew. As I was being beaten mercilessly by a guard for fidgeting, for not being able to stand still for hours at an appel, a roll call, I looked into my mother's eyes. She was standing next to me, silently, and she was pleading with me, don't cry, hold on. And I didn't. I recall thinking, I will never let them know how much they are hurting me. At 5.5, I had the rebellion in me. I will not show them. I will not let them know the pain they're inflicting on me. I am sure that many of you here who are Holocaust survivors have their own memories, and you remember when your entire being rebelled, but you felt powerless, abandoned, so you just had to resign. On an icy, windy day, I stood and watched helplessly as little girls from the nearby barrack were marched away, crying and shivering, to the gas chamber. They were covered with rags, and some of them didn't even have any shoes and were walking barefoot in the snow. They were very young, as I was, 6 or 7, but starvation shrunk their bodies, and they appeared even younger. They too became ashes. Is my barrack next? I silently wondered. I thought that we all have to die, that it was normal. If you're a Jewish child, you have to die. I wasn't even sure what Jewish was, because I never saw any celebrations. But death, child, Jewish, seemed a normal thought. I knew nothing about partisans saving Jews from ghettos and camps. I knew nothing about the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, nor of the Allies and the D-Day, nor of the invasion of Normandy. At that time, we were victims in a moral vacuum. But today, however, we have an obligation not only to remember, which is very, very important, but also to warn and to teach that hatred only begets more hatred, killing more killing. Instead, our revenge has been to build a strong Jewish country and raise our families in peace. Many of you here, I saw, have your wonderful families with you, just as I do. 80 years after liberation, the world is again in crisis. Our Jewish Christian values have been overshadowed worldwide by prejudice, fear, suspicion, and extremism. And the rampant anti-Semitism that is spreading among the nations is shocking. It's shocking to all of us, to our children and our grandchildren. Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, is fighting for its very existence and its way of life. We mourn not only the fallen soldiers and the hostages, but also the turbulence and mistrust in our society. We pray for strength, resilience, and of course, hope, which has to be part of our daily life. We all of us, must reawaken our collective conscience to transform this violence, anger, hatred, and malignancy that has so powerfully gripped our society into a humane and just world before these terrible, terrible negative forces will destroy us all. It is an enormous task, but our Jewish sages teach us the time is short, the task is great. We may not be able to complete it, but we have an obligation to start. Thank you.
That was Tova Friedman there, receiving a standing ovation from some of the audience. Tova Friedman herself, a Holocaust survivor, an Auschwitz survivor, talking about her experience being a child when the camp was liberated. She said she was 6.5 years old when the gates at Auschwitz were finally opened.
O zabranie głosu proszę ocalałego z obozu Auschwitz.
May I now ask
Pana
Mr.
Weintrauba.
Leon Weintraub, the Holocaust survivor, to take the floor.
And the next speaker is Leon Weintraub, 98-year-old Leon Weintraub.
Drodzy i bardzo mi bliscy, ocaleni z tego nazistowskiego obozu
of the Nazi concentration camp,
wielce szanowni przedstawiciele
distinguished
władz
representatives of
państwowych,
governmental,
organizacji
organizational, and
drodzy
religious
goście
authorities,
i bliscy
dear
i daleka.
guests from near and far.
Urodziłem się
I was born in Łódź on the 1st of January 1926. So I am 99 years old. After my father's death, when I was just 18 months, this was 1927, my mother converted all available resources into capital and she opened a small laundry business at Kamienna Street, which is now Włókiennicza Street. And then the entire family, comprising of my mother and her 5 children, we occupied just 2 small rooms. This is where we lived, and this is where she worked. Now, I started my primary school, and I was a good student. So, after the 6th grade, I got admitted free of charge to a Piłsudski gymnasium at Sienkiewicza Street in Łódź. And I was about to start my further education on the 1st of September 1939. Now, the invasion of our country by the Nazi army disrupted these plans. And in the winter of 1940, we were forcibly moved to the ghetto Litzmannstadt that the Nazi established. While in the ghetto, I worked in the Metal 1 department, and I spent them there almost 5 years. 5 years of hard labor and constant hunger. In August 1944, the liquidation of the ghetto began, and we were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. My mother and her sister, my auntie Eve, were murdered on the same day in the gas chamber, and then they were burned in the crematorium. And then we were stripped of all our humanity. First, we were stripped naked and robbed of all our personal belongings. Then they brutally shaved all our hair, quite often with painful skill removal, which was so painful when carbolic fluid was used to disinfect. And then we were dressed in rags. Trousers, shirts, jackets. And then clogs, wooden clogs. This is how we were reduced to mere disposable items. I suffered a lot. I felt utterly alone. I was so brutally separated from my family. I also suffered because of this constant black smoke, reeking of burnt flesh, that was rising from the chimneys. This was particularly maddening. After a few weeks, I managed to sneak out illegally of Auschwitz-Birkenau, unnoticed by the capos and SS men. I joined a group of prisoners who were selected to work outside of the camp. In Dönau, which was a sub-camp of Gross Rosen, I worked as an electrician. In late February 1945, after a 3-day death march, we were transported to the Flossenburg camp, and then a month later to the Natzweiler Stutthof Offenburg camp. I was liberated by the French troops near Donaueschingen on the 20th of April 1945. As I was diagnosed with general debility and I only weighed 35 kilos, I was also diagnosed with typhus, I had to be hospitalized for several weeks, first in Donaueschingen, and then I was stationed in the French military sanatorium on the Reichenau Peninsula.
Jesienią roku 1946
In the autumn of 1946, I started my medical studies in Göttingen. I returned to Poland in November 1950, and after graduation in 1954, I worked at the Clinic of Obstetrics and Women's Diseases of the Medical Academy in Warsaw. But owing to rising anti-Semitism in Poland, I lost my job in February 1969, where I was the head of the obstetrics and gynecology department in Otwock Hospital. So in September 1969, I emigrated to neutral Sweden together with my family. Today, we are celebrating the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz camp. This Nazi concentration camp symbolizes the unprecedented cruelty in the treatment of people throughout history. This is a place where the techniques of mass and industrial murder were first introduced. It grieves me deeply to see in many European countries, but also in Poland, Nazi-style uniforms and slogans openly paraded at marches. It grieves me to see that this is happening without any consequences. These people self-proclaim themselves as national champions, but at the same time, they proclaim the hateful ideology of German Nazis. This is the ideology that murdered millions who were considered subhuman under the sign of the swastika. So this ideology, an attitude that preaches hostility and hatred towards others, this defines racism, anti-Semitism and homophobia as virtues. And this is occurring here in our country, which has suffered so much, which has endured extensive damage under the Nazi occupation. I urge all people of goodwill, and especially I ask of the young people, be sensitive to all expressions of intolerance and resentment towards those who are different, regardless of their skin color, religion, or sexual orientation. In today's digital world, it is so incredibly challenging to distinguish between genuine intention and the pursuit of popularity, the need to exist that stems from a conscious and persistent agenda. I repeat, therefore, be attentive and be vigilant. We, the survivors, we understand that the consequence of being considered different is active persecution, the effects of which we have personally experienced. And we did experience it very hard. So let us be very serious and let's take seriously what the enemies of democracy preach. They generally seek to implement the slogans they promote. If they succeed in gaining power, we must avoid the mistake of the 1930s. when the world failed to take seriously the Nazi regime. The plans to create a state free of Jews, Roma, and people of different opinions, or sick, or those deemed unfit to live, were underestimated. Therefore, I implore everybody to intensify their efforts in countering the views that led to the genocide we are commemorating today. Modern understanding of our heritage and our DNA confirms that there is but only one race of humans, Homo sapiens. Therefore, the theory of racism, which is a fundamental principle of Nazi ideology, is false and incompatible with reality. Let me assure you, as a doctor, as a gynecologist, when I perform operations, whatever the patient's skin, the tissues beneath are identical in every person. Astronomers tell us that there are trillions of solar systems and galaxies and that are similar to ours. Our planet is merely a speck in the vast cosmos. Isn't it absurd to divide the inhabitants of the speck into thousands of disparate groups that are often and sadly hostile to each other? Every year, there are lengthy discussions taking place in parliaments regarding budget cuts. Significant amounts are, however, allocated to armaments. In contrast, the peaceful coexistence of nations could be achieved without any financial cost. Just think about the positive impact this expenditure could create. I wish to express my gratitude and appreciation to the management and all the staff of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum for their tireless efforts in preserving the memory of the victims of the Nazi ideology and for combating prejudice and hostility toward others. Well, allowing the memory of millions of innocent victims to fade would be equivalent to robbing them of their lives for a second time. The commemoration of the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz serves as a reminder of the inhumane treatment of individuals, but also it is a warning against the increasingly vocal movements of the radical and anti-democratic right. I kindly ask everyone now to stand and observe with a moment of silence the memory of the victims of the degenerate German nationalism.
Dziękuję.
Thank you.
That was the, let me correct myself, that was the 99-year-old Leon Weintraub speaking there. So the oldest of the speakers that we've heard today, making an appeal to the youngest listeners in the audience, saying, please be sensitive to all expressions of intolerance. And he went down the list of what he says we're seeing today. So he was actually, of all of these speakers today, was trying to make that arc of history from what happened 80 years ago to today. making it relevant to what we're seeing in today's society. Janina,
And I
let
think-
me ask you, what struck you?
No, I think you're right. I think the several points that are repeated, and definitely this almost desperate plea by the elders, by the survivors, saying, we have lived through this, we have seen the signs, we ask you to be very aware of what's happening before you wake up and it's too late. And we need to look at inhumane treatment of people and minorities of all kinds and discrimination of all kinds to realize that this is a glaring, alarming sound to be wary of. And of course, they all mentioned the rise of anti-Semitism, the real fear of anti-Semitism that is very much shaping the lives of Jews around the world. Still, 80 years after the end of the Holocaust, there's not a single Jewish institution or synagogue, in Europe that is not under, heightened security.
And we see it here in Berlin every day.
You see it in Germany as well, indeed, and you'll see the same in France. You also hear that also in the U.S. that for many years felt like a very safe place for many Jews, and we've seen that has also changing, including attacks on synagogues, Australia even, something we've heard about last week. So this is definitely still a big problem, and I think another challenge. We were seeing some of them mentioning Israel and the importance of Israel and the struggle that Israel is going through now against Hamas, and I think the challenge is how to hold these two separately, to understand the problem of anti-Semitism on one hand and the other issue connected to the political aspect of the Israeli struggles and fighting.
Were you surprised how much the October 7th Hamas attacks were mentioned, or were you surprised that we didn't hear more about that from these four speakers?
Well, I was not surprised. I think anybody attuned to the discourse in the Jewish world sees that this linkage is very much felt by Jews around the world every day. We are seeing now Ronald Lauder. He's a very big Jewish philanthropist. He is also very much a very great supporter of the Auschwitz Institution and Council himself. He's about to take the stage right there. But we are definitely seeing that this, there's two overshadowing elements to Jews in Germany.
That speaks not only to young people, but also speaks to the adults and the elders teaching young people. And I saw a study today that said just in Germany, among people 30 and younger, only 10% of those who were questioned recognized the word Holocaust or Auschwitz.
Well, that's a horrifying statistic. If this is the case, of course.
And that speaks to where the current generation is maybe failing in, bridging and teaching the young people about what happened in the past.
Correct, and I think it's also about what is the lesson. Is the lesson is never again, as mentioned also by some of the survivors we've seen. Is it never again? Period, no matter to whom, no matter where, no matter what the consequences are, or is it a more particular message for Jews, and then the focus is on, on security for Jews or support to the specific Jewish communities, which is, of course, it's still an important goal to aspire for, but might not be the whole message. Protecting the Jews, yes, protecting other minorities, protecting other groups of minorities that are discriminated against, or treating an inhumane treatment. Yeah. This is definitely the more universal message that will help us also, from going down the same road. Because we are seeing populist agendas and ideologies taking more and more hold in the world. It's a phenomenon in Europe and the US and wherever we look. And I think this is exactly the plea that we've been hearing today from those survivors who've said, we've lived through it. We are begging you, notice what is happening and be cautious and be active. There is still a way to, this is not a destiny. There's still a way out.
Before we run out of time, Sean, let me just ask you, we know that every 5 years, the liberation of Auschwitz, the commemoration is considered a major commemoration. So in 5 years, when we're talking about 85 years, we know that the number of survivors, that number is dwindling. Can we say that this is the last time that we have heard the survivors physically able to shout out across the generations?
Well, we still had people like Tova Friedman that we've seen that was 6.5 years old when the camp was liberated. But of course, the way she survived, I mean, she talked about, she said that her experiences, her memories, for example, she still vividly remembers being brought into Auschwitz in this cattle cart with her mom and Nidi. But so, of course, the kind of memories they have change, but the lessons that can teach us would still remain. And of course, we need to think of the day after. What happens in 20 years, you know? And the message that is resonating loud and clear should go beyond these specific individuals and their bravery stories.
Shani Rouzanis, as always, Shani, it's good to have you here in the studio. Good to have you here to help us to put into context this 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Thank you.
You're welcome.